There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a friend leaning against you on a couch. You don't recognize them as fault lines until the ground has already shifted beneath you, until the entire landscape of your world has been irrevocably altered. You are left standing in the after, trying to map a territory that no longer matches the one you held in your mind, realizing that the tectonic plate of your heart moved when you were not paying attention, or perhaps when you were paying too much attention. For me, that moment smelled like old books and the faint, clean scent of Finn's laundry detergent, and it was illuminated by the flickering blue light of a movie's closing credits. He was asleep, or at least pretending to be. It was a state he occupied often in my presence, a surrender that felt both profoundly intimate and agonizingly casual. His head was a solid, warm weight on my shoulder, his arm draped loosely across my stomach, and the rhythm of his breathing was a slow, oceanic current against my side. For 3 months, this had been our ritual. This strange, unspoken navigation of a space that was no longer just friendship, but had no name, no definition, no safe harbor. It was a territory of ambiguous touch and plausible deniability, and I was its sole, silent cartographer, mapping every coastline of his sleeping form, every tremor of his breath, every sigh that could mean everything or nothing at all. The air in my small apartment was thick with all the words I had never said, a dense atmosphere that I felt I had to push through just to draw a simple breath. Tonight, the silence felt different. The movie had ended 10 minutes ago, the final notes of the score fading into the ambient noise of the city outside my window. Yet, he hadn't moved. He hadn't stirred with the usual sleepy murmur, the preamble to him untangling himself and heading home. The weight of his head on my shoulder felt more deliberate, the stillness more charged. I was a photographer by trade, a student of light and shadow, of the minute details that tell a larger story. I spent my days looking for the decisive moment, the fraction of a second when truth reveals itself in a gesture, in the catch of light, in an eye. And in that quiet room, I felt that moment approaching. It was in the way his fingers twitched against my shirt, not in sleep, but in thought. It was in the almost imperceptible tensing of his jaw, a signal of wakefulness he was trying to conceal. My own body was a statue carved from anxiety. Every nerve ending was alight, hyper-aware of the points of contact between us, the press of his thigh against mine, the heat of his palm through the thin cotton of my shirt, the soft brush of his hair against my neck. I had lived with this secret ache for him for so long that it had become a part of my anatomy, and phantom limb that throbbed with a constant, low-grade yearning. To have him this close, this often, was a form of exquisite torture. It was like being a man dying of thirst, forced to live at the edge of a beautiful, shimmering lake, allowed to feel its cool mist on his skin, but never permitted to drink. I had accepted these terms. I had told myself that this strange, physical closeness was a gift I should not question, a fragile ecosystem that my wanting could destroy. So I sat there, frozen, cataloging the sensory data, the scent of him, the sound of his breathing, the pressure of his weight. I was building a fortress of observation around my feelings, hoping that if I could just analyze the moment perfectly, I could control it, could keep it from spilling over into the dangerous territory of hope. But then his breathing changed. It hitched, just once, a tiny snag in the smooth fabric of the rhythm he had maintained. He was not asleep. He had not been asleep for some time. The realization landed not with a crash, but with a slow, sinking dread that was also, terrifyingly, a kind of thrill. The ground was beginning to shift. His voice, when it came, was a rough whisper, barely disturbing the quiet. "Leo." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I didn't trust my own voice. I managed a sound, a low hum of acknowledgement that I hoped sounded calm, sleepy, unbothered. It was the performance of a lifetime. He shifted, lifting his head from my shoulder. The sudden absence of his warmth was a shock, a physical loss that made me feel cold and exposed. He turned to face me in the dim light, his body angled towards mine on the narrow couch. The blue light from the television screen painted one side of his face in an ethereal glow, leaving the other in deep shadow. It was a portrait of conflict, of duality. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the same warring currents that I felt churning inside of me. He was close. So close that I could count the flecks of gold in his irises, could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek. "Don't fall for me, okay?" He had said it before. Once. Weeks ago, in a similar state of drowsy proximity, his voice muffled by a pillow. It had been delivered with a drowsy, teasing smile, a clumsy attempt to name the strangeness between us and render it harmless, to put a fence around it. A joke. But it was a joke with a knife hidden inside, and it had gutted me then, and it gutted me now. Hearing it again, in this charged, wakeful silence, was different. It wasn't a warning. It felt like a plea, or a question. He was looking at me, his gaze so direct, so vulnerable, that it stripped away all my defenses. He was not asking me not to fall. He was asking me if I already had. And in my silence, in my inability to lie, he found his answer. The air crackled, the space between us shrinking until it was nothing at all, until the only thing that existed was the precipice on which we stood. The final, quiet moment before the world changed forever. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon. Finn and I were not a sudden confluence of events. We were a slow erosion, a river carving a canyon over years. We met in college, two orbits that seemed destined to intersect. I was on a photography scholarship, a quiet observer by nature and by trade, more comfortable behind a lens than in the middle of a crowd. He was the star forward on the soccer team, a whirlwind of easy confidence and kinetic energy, the kind of person who seemed to collect friends effortlessly, like his personality was a form of gravity. We shouldn't have worked. On paper, we were a study in contrasts. The artist and the athlete, the introvert and the extrovert, the quiet anchor and the unstoppable force. Our friendship began not with a grand event, but with a series of small, mundane collisions. We were assigned as lab partners in a mandatory geology class we were both dreading. I remember him sliding into the seat next to me, dropping his bag with a heavy thud, and giving me a lopsided grin that was both an apology for his lateness and an invitation. "So," he'd said, gesturing to the box of rocks on our table, "you know anything about igneous intrusions?" I didn't, but I knew how to study. He, it turned out, knew how to make even the most tedious subject feel less like a chore. He'd narrate the life cycle of a sedimentary rock as if it were an epic sports drama. He'd tap his pen against the table in a rhythm that, instead of annoying me, I found grounding. I helped him pass the class. He helped me feel less invisible. After that, our lives became intertwined. He'd drag me to team parties where I'd stand in a corner, nursing a drink, and he would somehow always find his way back to me, a fixed point in his social universe, checking in as if he were tethered to me by some invisible string. I, in turn, would go to his games, my camera a shield that allowed me to watch him openly. I learned the language of his movements on the field, the explosive power in his stride, the sharp, intelligent cuts he made through the defense, the frustration in the set of his shoulders after a missed shot, the pure, unadulterated joy that lit up his entire being when he scored. I was documenting his life through my lens, but I was also memorizing it, archiving the moments for myself. He was all light and motion, a subject I could never grow tired of studying. My feelings for him didn't arrive in a flash flood. They were more like a slow, rising tide, so gradual that I didn't realize I was submerged until the water was already over my head. It was in the small things. The way he'd remember a passing comment I'd made about a photographer I admired, and then surprise me with a book of their work weeks later. The way he'd instinctively move to stand between me and a crowd, creating a small pocket of calm for me without ever saying a word about it. The way he would call me after a date, not to brag, but to talk, to process, his voice a low murmur on the other end of the line as he tried to figure out his own heart. I became the keeper of his stories, the quiet vault for his uncertainties. And somewhere in the keeping, my friendship curdled into love. It was a quiet, hopeless kind of love, Finn was, for all intents and purposes, straight. He dated women, beautiful and bright women who seemed to fit so easily into the space beside him. I learned to compartmentalize. I built a room inside myself where my feelings for him lived, and I kept the door firmly shut. I became an expert in the art of emotional redirection, channeling my affection into the acceptable forms of friendship. I was his biggest supporter, his most reliable friend, his late-night confidant. The role suited me, and for a long time, it was enough. The pain of my unspoken feelings was a fair price to pay for the simple, uncomplicated joy of his presence in my life. I would watch him fall in love, and I would feel the familiar, dull ache in my chest, and then I would help him navigate the eventual heartbreak, and the cycle would repeat. I was the constant, the shoreline to his turbulent ocean, and I convinced myself that was all I ever wanted to be. I was a master of self-deception, because the alternative, the thought of losing him entirely, was simply unthinkable. The foundation of our friendship was solid, built of shared history and mutual respect. But beneath it, unknown to him, was a fault line of my own making, a deep and secret love that was just waiting for the right tremor to crack everything wide open. The tremor arrived in the form of a woman named Sarah, and then, more accurately, in her departure. Sarah was different from the others. She was a software architect, sharp and witty and ambitious, and for 2 years, she seemed to be Finn's perfect match. She understood his drive, she challenged his intellect, and she possessed a calm that seemed to soothe his restless energy. When he was with her, he seemed more settled, more grounded than I had ever seen him. A part of me, the part that truly loved him and wanted his happiness above all else, was genuinely happy for him. The other, more selfish part of me felt the door to that secret room inside me click shut, the lock turning with a final, definitive thud. This, I told myself, was it. This was his future, and I made my peace with it. I learned to be their friend, the stable, supportive third point of a triangle. The breakup, when it happened, was sudden and seismic. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive fight, but a quiet, mutual acknowledgement that their futures were diverging. Sarah had an opportunity in London, a dream job she couldn't refuse. Finn, whose entire life and career were rooted here, couldn't go. There were no villains, no betrayals, just the slow, sad drift of 2 lives onto different paths. This lack of acrimony made it harder for him, somehow. There was no anger to cling to, no righteous indignation to fuel him. There was only a profound and hollow sense of loss. He was adrift. Simultaneously, a massive project he was leading at work began to fall apart. A key client pulled out, deadlines were collapsing, and his team was looking to him for answers he didn't have. The 2 pillars of his life, his relationship and his career, the external structures that defined his sense of self, crumbled within the same month. The easy confidence that had always been his trademark began to fray at the edges. The kinetic energy that once propelled him forward now seemed to turn inward, becoming a restless, anxious hum. He started losing weight. There were dark circles under his eyes that even his cheerful bravado couldn't hide. He was a ship that had lost its rudder and its sails in the middle of a storm. And he steered himself toward me. My apartment became his sanctuary, the one place he didn't have to perform. He would show up at my door late at night, his keycard and wallet in his hand, his eyes weary. He wouldn't always talk about it. Sometimes he would just sink into my worn armchair, put his head in his hands, and just breathe for a solid 10 minutes. Other times, the words would pour out of him in a torrent of frustration and grief, a jumble of code and deadlines and memories of Sarah. I just listened. I made him tea he rarely drank and food he would pick at. I didn't offer solutions or platitudes. I just offered my presence, a quiet, unwavering space for him to exist in his brokenness. I was the shoreline, and the storm of his life was finally washing him up on my sand. It was during this period that the lines began to blur. The physical boundary that had always existed between us, the unspoken buffer of platonic friendship, began to dissolve. It started subtly. He'd fall asleep on my couch while I worked late in my studio space, and I would come out to find him curled under the Afghan my grandmother had made, looking younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. I would drape a second blanket over him and turn off the lights, my heart aching with a feeling so potent it felt like a physical injury. He was seeking comfort, and I was the source. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. I was becoming his safe harbor, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I would do anything to keep him safe, even from myself. This was the shift, the critical change in atmospheric pressure before the storm. He wasn't just my friend anymore. He was a man in need of refuge, and he had chosen, unconsciously or not, to take refuge in me. The foundation of our friendship was no longer just supporting our history. It was now bearing the full weight of his present pain, and I could feel the first, faint cracks beginning to form. The ritual began on a Friday. It had been a particularly brutal week for Finn. I knew because the text messages had been sparse, and the ones he did send were clipped and tense. He showed up at my door around 9, looking utterly depleted, like a battery drained to zero. He didn't even say hello, just walked past me and collapsed face down on my couch, his whole body surrendering to the cushions with a long, weary groan. I didn't say anything. I just went to the kitchen, poured him a glass of water he wouldn't drink, and set it on the coaster on the end table. I put on a mindless action movie, something with lots of explosions and very little plot, and settled into the armchair across from him. For 2 hours, we sat in the flickering darkness, the silence between us filled only by the sounds of cinematic chaos. Sometime during the final, cacophonous car chase, I looked over and saw that his eyes were closed, his breathing deep and even. He was asleep. He stayed the night. He woke up around 3 in the morning, disoriented, and I just pointed him to the spare room I used for storing camera equipment and old prints. In the morning, he looked sheepish, apologizing for imposing. I just shrugged and handed him a mug of coffee. "It's fine," I said. "You looked like you needed it." He gave me a small, grateful smile that made my chest ache. That was the first time. It was innocent, circumstantial. Plausible deniability was firmly intact. The next Friday, it happened again. This time, it felt more intentional. He texted me in the afternoon. "Movie night. I'll bring pizza." It wasn't a plea for help. It was a plan. A routine in the making. That night, he didn't collapse on the couch. He sat at one end. I sat at the other, the pizza box a formidable barrier between us. But as the movie wore on, the geography of the couch began to change. He stretched his legs out, his feet resting near my hip. An hour later, he had shifted, his back against the armrest, his legs now draped fully across my lap. He did it so casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I, on the other hand, went completely still. I could feel the heat and weight of his legs through my jeans. I focused intently on the movie, my entire consciousness narrowed down to the pressure of his ankles resting on my thighs. My mind was a deafening roar of panic and wonder. He fell asleep like that, and I didn't move for another hour, afraid that the slightest shift would break the spell. The ritual evolved week by week, a slow, methodical erosion of the space between us. The pizza and a movie became our standing Friday appointment. The couch became our shared territory. The next step was the lean. He started sitting next to me instead of opposite me. Halfway through the movie, he'd yawn, a great, dramatic, theatrical yawn, and then his head would find its way to my shoulder. The first time he did it, I thought my heart would stop. I sat ramrod straight, a pillar of feigned nonchalance, while every cell in my body screamed. He smelled of soap and the city and something that was just uniquely Finn. I tried to focus on the film, but all I could perceive was the solid warmth of his head, the soft tickle of his hair against my skin, the gentle rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. It was after a month of this, a month of these increasingly intimate, unspoken arrangements, that he first said the words. He was half asleep on my shoulder, his voice a low, gravelly murmur against my collarbone. "Hey, Leo," I hummed in response, afraid to speak. "You're, like, the most comfortable pillow in the world." I felt a smile I couldn't suppress. Then he added, his words slightly slurred with sleep, "Just don't fall for me, okay?" He chuckled, a soft, breathy sound. It was meant as a joke, a way to acknowledge the weirdness of what was happening, of a straight guy using his best friend as a human mattress. It was a clumsy, self-protective jab at the intimacy we were cultivating, a way to label it as safe, as platonic. But for me, it was a punch to the gut. The casual cruelty of it, the way it highlighted the absolute hopelessness of my situation, was devastating. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the screen, the colors blurring through the sudden film of tears in my eyes, and I felt the weight of his head on my shoulder become impossibly heavy. But he didn't stop. The joke was made, the boundary supposedly drawn, and yet he continued to cross it. The ritual became more entrenched. It was no longer just leaning. He started to pull the throw blanket over both of us, creating a small, warm cave in the dim light of the living room. Under the cover of that blanket, his hand would find its way to my stomach, resting there with an unnerving possessiveness. Or he would shift until he was fully pressed against my side, his arms slung over me, his face tucked into the crook of my neck. He was cuddling me. There was no other word for it. And I was letting him. I was a willing participant in my own exquisite torture. My internal monologue during these sessions was a frantic, desperate thing. I would analyze his every movement, trying to decipher its meaning. Was this just about comfort? Was he so starved for simple human touch after his breakup that he would take it from anyone, even me? Or was there something else? A nascent feeling he couldn't name or admit. I would photograph him in my mind, composing the shot. The way the lamplight caught the curve of his ear, the relaxed set of his mouth in sleep, the trusting way his hand rested on my chest. I was documenting the evidence of a crime I wasn't sure was even being committed. It was a beautiful, agonizing routine. It was a source of the deepest comfort I had ever known, and it was a wellspring of the most profound anxiety. It was the heart of our slow burn, the long, simmering tension of a pot that was inevitably, terrifyingly, going to boil over. And every Friday, I would open the door, and we would begin the ritual again, both of us pretending we didn't know the rules were changing. The night it finally happened was a night like any other, which is to say it was heavy with the same unspoken tension that had come to define our Fridays. It was late autumn, and a cold rain was lashing against the windows, isolating us from the rest of the world, encasing my apartment in a bubble of warmth and quiet intimacy. We had watched a documentary about deep-sea exploration, a subject chosen for its lulling, hypnotic quality. As the credits rolled, showing ethereal, bioluminescent creatures drifting through an infinite blackness, the room fell silent save for the drumming of the rain and the soft hum of the television. Finn was tucked against me, his head on my chest, the familiar weight both a comfort and a torment. But tonight, as I said, was different. The silence that followed the film wasn't the usual sleepy, post-movie quiet. It was a living thing. It was thick and watchful. I could feel his wakefulness. There was no pretense of sleep in the steady, measured rhythm of his breathing, in the subtle tension in the arm he had draped over my waist. My own heart was a frantic metronome, counting down to a moment I both craved and dreaded. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, on the names scrolling by in white against a black background, as if they held some secret code I could decipher. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any action on my part would shatter the fragile, crystalline structure of the moment. He was the one who broke it. He pushed himself up slowly, deliberately, untangling his limbs from mine. The loss of his warmth was immediate and stark, a physical ache. He didn't move away, though. He just shifted, turning to face me on the couch. The space between us was now a chasm of a few inches, but it felt more charged than when we had been touching. The blue light from the screen cast him in that same conflicting portrait of light and shadow, his expression unreadable and yet overwhelmingly vulnerable. His eyes searched mine, and in their depths, I saw a maelstrom of confusion, fear, and a raw, unguarded need that stole the air from my lungs. Leo. His voice was a rasp, a sound scraped from the bottom of his throat. I could only nod, my throat tight. Words felt like foreign objects, too clumsy and loud for the delicate atmosphere of the room. He didn't say anything else for a long time. He just looked at me, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. I could see the battle raging within him. The frantic work of his mind trying to build walls of logic and reason around a feeling that defied both. I could see the moment he gave up. It was a visible surrender, a softening in his shoulders, a slight parting of his lips. He was tired of fighting. He re-spoke the words from months ago, but their meaning was entirely transformed. This time, they were not a joke, not a warning. They were a confession of his own terror. "Don't fall for me," he whispered, and it sounded like a prayer for something already lost. His eyes were pleading with me, but what he was pleading for, I couldn't tell. For me to save him from this? For me to tell him it was okay? For me to lie and say my heart was not already, irrevocably his? And then he leaned in. It was a slow, hesitant movement, a closing of the final inches that separated our worlds. He was giving me time to pull away, to stop him, to preserve the safety of our friendship. It would have been the sensible thing to do, the smart thing. But I had been sensible for years, and all it had brought me was a quiet, hollow ache. I didn't move. I held his gaze, and in that shared look, I gave him my permission. I gave him everything. The first touch of his lips was impossibly soft, tentative, a question. It was just a gentle pressure, a moment of discovery. But then a tremor went through him, a deep, shuddering breath, and the question became an answer. He kissed me, and it was nothing like the gentle exploration it had started as. It was a release of all the pent-up tension, all the unspoken longing, all the confusion and fear that had been building between us for months. His hand came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, pulling me closer with a desperate strength I had only ever seen him use on the soccer field. It was a kiss of overwhelming, undeniable need. It was harder, deeper, and more consuming than any kiss I had ever imagined. It wasn't gentle or romantic in the traditional sense. It was raw and honest and hungry. It tasted of rain and salt and the metallic tang of desperation. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of a fortress crumbling to dust. In that moment, he wasn't my straight friend. He wasn't the unknowing initiator. He was just Finn, and he was kissing me as if I were the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart, as if I were air and he had been holding his breath for a lifetime. It was the crossing, and we both knew, with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty, that there was no going back. The aftermath was not a gentle descent into a new reality. It was a violent crash. As quickly as the kiss had ignited, it was extinguished. Finn pulled back with a gasp, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror, as if he had just woken from a dream to find it horrifyingly real. He looked at me, then at his own hands, then back at me, his expression a chaotic scramble of emotions I couldn't begin to parse. He scrambled off the couch, his movements clumsy and frantic, like an animal caught in a trap. The silence that rushed back in to fill the space was no longer thick with tension. It was sharp and jagged, full of broken things. I have to go," the words tumbled out of him, ragged and breathless. He wouldn't look at me. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the armchair, fumbling with the zipper, his eyes fixed on the door as if it were a life raft. "Finn," I started, my own voice sounding distant and strange to my ears. "Don't," he cut me off, the word sharp. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes shattered me. It was pure, undiluted panic. He looked at me as if I were the source of his fear, as if I had done this to him. "I'm sorry. I can't," and then he was gone. The front door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the apartment with a deafening finality. I was left alone on the couch, the imprint of his body still warm beside me, the ghost of his kiss still burning on my lips. The world had not just shifted, it had fractured, and I was standing alone in the ruins. The days that followed were a special kind of hell, a silent, gray purgatory. My texts went unanswered. My calls went straight to voicemail. It was as if he had vanished from the earth, or worse, as if he were deliberately and methodically excising me from his life. The silence was an accusation. It confirmed my deepest fears, that the kiss had been a mistake, a moment of weakness and grief on his part that he now deeply regretted. I had misinterpreted everything. I had taken his need for comfort and twisted it into something it was never meant to be. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, dissecting it with the cold, brutal precision of a forensic analyst. I tried to find evidence of my own delusion, but I couldn't deny the truth of it. The desperation, the need, it had been his, not just mine. He had initiated it. He had kissed me with a force that had left no room for ambiguity. He had crossed the line, and then he had fled, leaving me stranded on the other side. The frustration began to curdle the hurt. I wasn't just heartbroken, I was angry. Angry at his cowardice, at his refusal to even grant me a conversation, at the casual way he had detonated my world, and then walked away from the blast site. After 5 days of agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than any possible truth. I needed a confrontation. I needed to look him in the eye and force him to acknowledge what had happened between us. So, I went to his apartment. My hands were shaking as I walked down the familiar hallway of his building. I stood outside his door for a long time, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I almost turned back a dozen times. But the thought of returning to my silent apartment, to the ghost-filled couch, was more terrifying than whatever awaited me behind that door. I took a deep breath and knocked. The wait was excruciating. I heard movement inside, a pause, and then the sound of the chains sliding. The door opened a crack. He stood there, looking even worse than he had the week before. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt I'd seen him in 3 days ago. He looked haunted. "Leo," my name was a weary sigh. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He hesitated, his hand still on the door. For a moment, I thought he was going to close it in my face. But then he seemed to deflate, the fight going out of him. He opened the door wider and stepped back, letting me in. His apartment was a mess. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. Clothes were strewn over the furniture. It was the physical manifestation of his internal chaos. He didn't offer me a seat. He just stood in the middle of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice flat. The truth would be a good start. I shot back, the anger finally bubbling to the surface. "What was that, Finn? What happened on my couch?" He flinched at the directness of the question. He started pacing, running a hand through his already messy hair. "I don't know. Okay. I don't know. It was a mistake. I was stressed. I was lonely. I wasn't thinking straight. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart." He was trying to erase it, to reduce that moment of earth-shattering connection to a mere symptom of his own personal crisis. He was making it all about him, invalidating everything I had felt. "A mistake?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like the most honest thing that has ever happened between us, that stopped him. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw the fear give way to a raw, painful vulnerability. His carefully constructed walls were beginning to crumble. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't be. I'm not." He couldn't even say the word. "My whole life, I've been one thing. I like women. I've always liked women. And then there's you." He gestured wildly in my direction, a gesture of both accusation and despair. "You're the only person who makes sense. When everything is falling apart, you're the only one I want to be around. You're the only one who makes me feel safe. And it's messing with my head. I don't know what it means," and there it was. The confession. Not a confession of love. Not yet. But a confession of his profound confusion and his deep, undeniable connection to me. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was running from a truth about his own heart that didn't fit the neat, orderly blueprint he had for his life. He was terrified. "So you kissed me," I said, piecing it together, my anger softening into a vast, aching empathy. "And it feels right. And that scares the hell out of you. So you run away and pretend it never happened." He nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He looked utterly lost. He was the unknowing initiator, the man who acted on an instinct his mind couldn't yet comprehend, and the conflict was tearing him apart. The confrontation had been necessary. It had forced the truth into the open, raw and painful as it was. The silence was broken. But now we were left standing in the wreckage, with no map and no idea how to begin rebuilding. The rebuilding was a slow, painstaking process. It was not a grand romantic gesture or a single, defining conversation that fixed everything. It was an exercise in patience and quiet intention. After his confession, a fragile truce settled between us. We didn't talk about the kiss again for a while. Instead, we started talking about everything else. He talked about the pressure he felt, the expectations he had for his own life, and the terrifying realization that his carefully laid plans might not be what he wanted after all. I talked about my own fears, about the loneliness of loving someone in secret, about the terror of risking a friendship that meant the world to me. We were two architects, surveying the rubble of what we had built, trying to figure out which pieces were worth saving. We didn't go back to the movie nights right away. The couch felt like a charged, dangerous place. Instead, we took walks. We would walk for hours through the city parks, the crisp autumn air a clean slate between us. On those walks, we found a new way of being together. The physical intimacy of the couch was replaced by a different kind of closeness, an emotional transparency we had never had before. He would tell me about his day at work, the small victories and frustrations. I would show him photos I had taken, explaining the light, the composition, the feeling I was trying to capture. We were relearning each other, not as friends with a secret, but as two people trying to navigate a new, uncharted landscape together. The first time he reached for my hand, we were walking by the river. It was a cold afternoon, and my hands were shoved deep in my pockets. He just stopped, turned to me, and gently pulled my hand from my pocket, his fingers lacing through mine. He didn't say a word. He just held my hand, his thumb stroking gently over my knuckles, and we continued walking. It was a simple, unambiguous gesture. It was not born of sleepy confusion or a need for comfort. It was a choice, a clear, deliberate statement. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for months finally began to recede. Slowly, carefully, we found our way back to the couch. It was Finn who suggested it. "I miss our movies," he said one day, his tone casual, but his eyes were asking a question. That Friday, when he came over, the air was different. There was no pretense, no plausible deniability. When he sat next to me, he didn't wait for the movie to start. He just leaned over and rested his head on my shoulder, a familiar gesture made new by the honesty that now existed between us. I wrapped my arm around him, pulling him closer, and he sighed, a sound not of weary surrender, but of contentment. It was a homecoming. We entered a new phase of quiet domesticity. He started leaving a toothbrush at my apartment, then a change of clothes. He stopped going home on Friday nights. Our ritual was reborn, stripped of its ambiguity and fear. The cuddling was no longer a question mark. It was our language. It was how we said, "I'm here. You're safe. We're okay." We learned to sleep together, not just in the same bed, but in a shared peace, our limbs tangled, our breathing synchronized. It was a deep, restful sleep that had eluded us both for months. We were healing together. There was no sudden declaration of love, no dramatic pronouncements. Our love was a quiet thing, built not on grand speeches, but on 1,000 small, consistent acts of care. It was in the way he started making coffee for me in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it. It was in the way I would set up my editing software at the kitchen table so I could be near him while he worked on his laptop. It was in the easy, comfortable silences that could stretch for hours, filled not with tension, but with a deep, mutual understanding. We were building our new normal, one quiet moment at a time. The door to that secret room inside me was no longer locked. It was wide open, and the light was pouring in. One evening, months later, we were on the couch, wrapped in the same blanket, watching some mindless movie. He was tracing patterns on my arm, his touch gentle and sure. He leaned in and kissed me, a soft, lingering kiss that held none of the desperate hunger of the first, but all of its honesty. It was a kiss of profound tenderness and certainty. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes searching my face. "Hey, Leo," he whispered. "Yeah." I whispered back, my heart full. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that reached his eyes. Fall for me. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was a statement, an invitation, a promise. It was the end of one story and the beginning of another. And I knew, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that I already had, and that I would spend the rest of my life continuing to do so. We had found our way out of the wreckage and into a beautiful, honest silence, a home we had learned to build together.